A 12-year-old black girl's ticket and dream was torn apart by a white agent's prejudice. It began with a sound so small you could almost miss it, the ripping of paper. Not thunder, not gunfire, just the quick, brutal tear of a boarding pass. And yet that sound carried the weight of centuries. A 12-year-old black girl stood frozen at the gate, ticket in her hand one moment, shredded halves in the next. No explanation, no verification, not even her name spoken aloud. The white gate agent's lips pressed thin, her eyes cold with judgment, as if to say, "You don't belong here." Around them, a terminal full of passengers watched. Some shifted awkwardly. Some looked away. Not one person intervened. The silence was deafening, more violent than words could ever be. Think about it. What if that were your daughter, your niece, a child you loved, humiliated in front of strangers for daring to believe she had a place in the sky? Wouldn't you want to scream? Wouldn't you want to tear down the counter yourself? But here's the part no one saw coming. That ripped ticket didn't bury her. It planted something. A vow. A fire. A promise that one day she would return, not as a passenger denied, but as the woman who would decide who truly gets to fly. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just expose one act of cruelty. It reveals the system behind it, and how one girl's humiliation at a gate became the spark of a revolution in the skies. The terminal swelled with noise, a restless ocean of voices, rolling suitcases, and the metallic chime of announcements overhead. For Zuri Carter, only 11 years old, the crowd blurred around her. All that mattered was the boarding pass clenched in her hand. She had pressed it so tightly that the edges curled, as if holding on hard enough might secure her place among the passengers bound for Chicago. Her mother's words echoed in her ears. "You were born to fly higher than the limits they place on you." The woman at the counter did not see a child carrying hope. She saw only a disruption. 15 years at this job had sharpened her instincts into prejudice, disguised as protocol. The girl's wide eyes, the worn jacket, the soft voice, none of it inspired trust. In her mind, this was one of those cases. Better to shut it down before it causes trouble, she told herself, already justifying the decision she hadn't yet made. Behind Zuri, the crowd shifted impatiently. A man in a baseball cap leaned close to his wife. "Figures," he muttered, "trying to scam a free ride." His wife pulled her purse tighter, nodding. A younger woman 2 spots back pressed her lips together, uncomfortable, yet unwilling to challenge authority. Her silence, like everyone else's, became its own verdict. Zuri raised her chin, summoning every ounce of courage, and slid the pass across the counter. "Flight C-22, she said softly, her chest filled with the fragile certainty that if she spoke clearly, everything would be fine. The agent picked up the paper between 2 nails as though it were contaminated. She let a slow second pass, enough to feed the doubt already spreading in the line. Then, with a sharp motion, she tore the boarding pass in half. The sound cracked through the air louder than the jets outside. Zuri gasped, her hands flying to catch the fragments as though they were pieces of herself. The world tilted. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. Around her, whispers rippled. The man in the cap gave a satisfied grunt. Someone chuckled under their breath. The young woman looked down at her shoes, ashamed, but still said nothing. "You don't belong on this flight," the agent said evenly, her voice stripped of compassion. "We'll need to verify your story." Story. The word struck harder than the tearing paper. As if her life, her work, her quiet hours, sketching engines and folding models, were nothing but fiction. Zuri blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. She folded the halves of the pass, sliding them into her pocket like broken glass, careful not to cut herself on their edges. From her side of the counter, the woman felt a flicker of satisfaction. Order restored, she thought. She had placed the child back where she believed she belonged. But from Zuri's side, another vow formed, silent and unshakable. They could shred paper, they could wound pride, but they could not chain the sky. The video did not fade with the news cycle. It grew sharper, louder, impossible to bury. Within a week, the clip of Zuri Carter's torn ticket had been played on every major network, dissected on late-night talk shows, and projected onto protest signs outside terminals from Atlanta to Los Angeles. The hashtag #LetHerFly became more than a digital cry. It spilled into the streets, where parents marched with their children, demanding answers not only from one employee, but from an entire system that allowed humiliation to hide behind the word procedure. Executives at the airline had hoped the outrage would pass. At first, they issued a short statement. "We regret the incident and are reviewing our training protocols." But the response only stoked fury. Politicians seized the moment. A senator from Illinois thundered on the Senate floor, holding up a still image of Zuri's shocked face. "If this were your child," he declared, "would you call it procedure, or would you call it what it is? Discrimination plain as day?" His words lit a fuse, and soon hearings were scheduled. Under pressure, the airline's CEO stepped before cameras in a crowded press room. Bright lights revealed the sweat on his forehead. Flanked by American flags and company logos, he read from prepared notes, but stumbled when he reached the part that mattered. We failed this young passenger. We failed her family, and we failed every customer who trusts us with their dignity." He paused, cleared his throat, then announced sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training for all staff, a new ombudsman's office to handle passenger complaints, and, most startling, a scholarship program for underrepresented youth in aviation, to be named after Zuri Carter. Reporters shouted questions. Was the employee fired? Was this just damage control? The CEO avoided specifics, but the truth was obvious. One girl's humiliation had forced the hand of a billion-dollar corporation. Zuri watched the press conference from her living room, the torn boarding pass still folded in her palm. She did not feel vindicated. Not yet. She was too young to measure what it meant to bend the will of powerful men. What she understood was simpler. The world had finally looked her in the eye. Across the country, families of color replayed the video with their children, voices breaking with both anger and recognition. Activists called for federal oversight of airline practices. Editorial boards debated whether systemic bias in travel was merely a symptom of a deeper national wound. What had begun as a cruel moment at a ticket counter had become a mirror America could not turn away from. For the ticket agent, the silence of her small suburban home was deafening. She could no longer walk into a grocery store without whispers following her. She told herself she had only done her job, but deep down she knew the truth. The world had watched her strip a child of dignity, and no script could rewrite what the camera had captured. And for Zuri, the pieces of paper in her pocket no longer felt like evidence of loss. They had become something else. A spark passed from hand to hand, screen to screen, until even the highest offices in the land were forced to reckon with it. Zuri Carter stood at the podium with cameras pointed straight at her, the room packed so tight you could hear reporters breathing. She looked too small for the microphone, too young for the chaos. Yet the silence inside that chamber was crushing, the kind that waits for a blow. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 torn halves of a boarding pass, holding them up for everyone to see. "This," she said, her voice raw, "is what they gave me back when I tried to fly." The microphones caught every crack in her tone. Not a mistake, not an accident. She looked me in the eye and ripped it. Because to her, a black child couldn't possibly belong on that plane. Gasps rippled through the room. A senator shifted uncomfortably. One reporter lowered her camera as though ashamed to record. "I was 11 years old. I wasn't dangerous. I wasn't lying. I was just a kid, holding a dream." And in front of a line of adults, she tore it apart. Do you know what's worse than the sound of paper ripping? The sound of nobody saying a damn thing. The words hit like stones. Reporters exchanged glances. Parents in the gallery clenched their fists. My story isn't unique, Zuri said, staring straight into the camera. It happens in different ways every day. Someone looks at you, decides you don't belong, and nobody stops them. But I'm here to tell you, it's not their right to decide. She dropped the torn ticket onto the podium, the pieces fluttering like a gauntlet. The silence that followed was unbearable, for this time it was the country itself that stood accused. The moment Zuri left the podium, the room exploded. Reporters shouted over one another, voices colliding with the clicks of cameras. Some tried to chase her down the aisle, but she kept walking, chin high, the shredded boarding pass still clutched in her hand. That night, the footage aired uncut on every major network. It wasn't polished, it wasn't softened. It was a child's voice shaking, then hardening into steel, accusing an entire country of complicity. Viewers at home froze mid-dinner. Mothers gripped their forks until their knuckles whitened. Fathers slammed fists against tables. Grandparents wept, whispering, "That could have been my baby." Social media lit up like wildfire. Hashtags multiplied. Zuri's truth, no more. Silence tore her ticket. Millions replayed the line that cut deepest. Do you know what's worse than the sound of paper ripping? The sound of nobody saying a damn thing. Parents repeated it to their children at the breakfast table. Teachers wrote it on classroom boards, and protesters painted it across cardboard signs. On Capitol Hill, the fallout was immediate. Politicians scrambled to issue statements. Some pledged reforms, others tried to downplay the incident as isolated. But the public wasn't buying it. Editorials blistered with fury. If silence is complicity, then every leader who stalls on this issue is guilty. Even airline shareholders panicked as stock prices dipped. The company had already promised reforms, but now the pressure was surgical, relentless. Names of executives trended alongside calls for resignations. And through it all, ordinary citizens kept replaying that image, an 11-year-old girl, too young for politics, too young for rage, standing before the nation and forcing it to look at itself. For once, America couldn't look away. When Zuri stepped away from the podium, the chamber erupted into chaos. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into the air, cameras flashing with relentless staccato. Her small figure slipped through the aisle, refusing to turn back, refusing to explain further. She had said enough. That night, every major network aired the footage in full. They did not edit the tremor in her voice, nor the anger that sharpened her words. Viewers across the country stopped mid-bite at dinner tables, television glow reflecting in stunned faces. In living rooms and diners, people sat in silence long after her speech ended. Parents leaned toward their children with tight voices. That could have been you. Grandparents shook their heads, tears welling. Others clenched fists, rage rising with the certainty that the humiliation of one child stood for a broader cruelty. In the streets, conversations turned into shouts. Strangers gathered in front of terminals, carrying cardboard signs scrawled with Zuri's words. Outside state capitals, voices rang through megaphones. What had been a private wound had now become a national reckoning. Editorial boards printed blistering condemnations. Columnists wrote that the image of a little girl clutching torn paper had done what years of hearings could not: expose the rot beneath polite excuses. Television panels that once argued airline policy now demanded accountability, not for a single worker, but for an entire system. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic spread. Shareholders called emergency meetings, stock prices dipped, and executives issued apologies they could no longer control. And on Capitol Hill, senators who had been silent scrambled to attach their names to reform bills, desperate to avoid being counted among those who looked away. For the public, the message was searing. A child had stood in front of them all and declared the nation guilty. For once, no one could deny it. The office didn't look like success. It looked like a battlefield disguised in glass and steel. Zuri Carter stood at the top floor of COAIR's headquarters, the city spread below her like a map she had been handed to redraw. On the desk behind her lay the artifact no one else in the building dared to ask about. A child's boarding pass, torn neatly in half, preserved in a thin glass frame. Some CEOs displayed awards, degrees, or photos with presidents. Zuri displayed her wound. She had grown into the kind of leader the industry wasn't ready for. Young, black, female, unshaken by the weight of men who thought boardrooms were theirs by birthright. Every magazine headline that called her a prodigy or symbol of progress missed the truth. She was a survivor of a humiliation so raw that it had carved itself into her bones. That humiliation had followed her into every decision, every negotiation, every sleepless night until she claimed the seat they swore she would never reach. Yet, standing in that office, she knew the war was far from over. The company she inherited was rotting beneath its polished surface. Reports piled on her desk told of quiet cruelties, veteran employees discarded as too old to adapt, women of color passed over again and again for men with half their experience, supervisors who whispered the phrase, cultural fit, like a code to keep power in familiar hands. Zuri touched the glass over the torn ticket. The memory was no longer pain. It was fuel. The same system that once stripped a 12-year-old girl of her dignity had now placed the controls in her hands. And this time, she promised herself, she wouldn't just fly. She would burn the old flight plan and chart a new sky for everyone. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and stale power. Men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs as if gravity itself bent for them. At the head of the table sat Zuri Carter, her hands folded, her face calm but unyielding. She had called the meeting after reading the latest internal audits. Older staff forced into early retirements, women of color kept off promotion lists, disciplinary actions used as weapons. One of the senior managers, a man with silver hair and a smirk that belonged to another century, cleared his throat. With respect, Ms. Carter, these are standard practices. They've been in place for decades. We reward energy, efficiency, people who can keep up. Tradition has kept this company profitable. A low murmur of agreement circled the table. Zuri didn't blink. She leaned forward, her voice even but sharp enough to cut through the room. Tradition? She repeated. You mean pushing out employees who gave their lives to this airline? You mean silencing women who trained their own bosses but were never considered worthy of the title? You mean protecting men who look like you at the expense of everyone else? The man chuckled, dismissive, tapping his pen. It's just the way things are. Always has been. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of a jet climbing through the sky outside the glass windows. Zuri's eyes locked on him, steady, unwavering. Then hear me clearly, she said, her voice dropping to a register that carried more weight than any shout. That way ends today. The rules that built this company may have worked for you, but they will not work for us. Not anymore. No one laughed now. The room, once so sure of itself, shifted uncomfortably. They had underestimated her before. They would not make that mistake again. The first file Zuri opened seemed routine, a security guard cited for sluggish performance. She almost skimmed it until she noticed the name. Carl Jenkins. 31 years of service, dozens of commendations. Yet suddenly, in the last 3 months, he'd been written up 6 times by the same manager. The notes grew crueler with each page. Old man slowing down. Dead weight. She asked to meet him in private. When Carl stepped into her office, hat in hand, he looked like a man bracing for his last day. His voice was barely above a whisper. "If you're letting me go, ma'am, I only ask that you give me one more week. My wife's in the hospital. She needs me steady." Zuri closed the folder. "Mr. Jenkins, you're not the problem," she said. "The system that tried to erase you is." By the end of the week, the manager who'd targeted him was removed from duty. Carl remained, head held higher than before. Then came a surprise from an unlikely corner. During one of Zuri's listening sessions with ground staff, an older woman in a plain gray uniform stood. Her hair was pulled back tight, her voice steady but threaded with years of restraint. "I have cooked meals for this company for 20 years. I've trained men who rose above me. I've watched women like me passed over until we learned not to ask. I've stayed silent. But silence," she said, "is heavy." Zuri studied her. She had expected complaints about hours, wages, benefits. She had not expected Evelyn Jackson to step out of the shadows with such fire. Within days, Mrs. Jackson was no longer a kitchen supervisor. She was the head of CoAir's new Ethics and Culture Board, with direct access to the CEO. The last encounter came without warning. A knock at her office door, a face from a memory she wished she could erase. Meredith Collins, the gate agent who had torn her boarding pass in two. Her uniform was gone. Lines creased her face where arrogance used to sit. She didn't ask to sit down. "I came to tell you I was wrong," Meredith said. Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "That day, I saw a problem. I didn't see a child. I can't undo it. But I need to say it out loud." The air was taut, every eye in the office waiting for Zuri's reply. She stood slowly. "Redemption isn't words on my carpet," she said. "It's what you do next. Leave here and prove you understand." Meredith nodded once and left without another word. The silence that followed was thicker than any applause. Zuri leaned back in her chair. For the first time, she realized the fight was no longer just hers. It belonged to every name, every story, every voice that had been ignored, until now. The announcement didn't come from a polished stage with camera crews waiting. It began in the humblest corner of the airline, a cramped maintenance hangar that smelled of grease and exhaustion. Workers were still in stained uniforms, some too tired to care. But when Zuri climbed onto an overturned toolbox, the room fell silent. Her voice was steady, but every word carried weight. "For years, your names were hidden in footnotes. Your stories were erased so others could shine. That ends tonight. From this day forward, no one who builds this company will be invisible again." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mechanics who had bent under decades of silence straightened their backs. Flight attendants with calloused smiles lowered their arms, unsure if they should believe her. Then she unveiled it. Every seat has a story. No scripted slogans, no corporate fluff. On every flight, passengers would hear the lives of those who worked behind the curtain. The janitor who worked nights so her grandson could afford school supplies. The gate agent who carried 2 jobs to keep her mother on medication. The pilot who once doubted the sky would ever belong to her. Their voices would no longer be hidden. At first, skepticism hung in the air. But then, weeks later, a passenger filmed himself weeping as he listened to a cabin video featuring Rosa Kim, the cook who had fed staff for 20 years without acknowledgement. "I thought I bought a ticket," he said, voice breaking. "But I was given a piece of someone's life." The clip spread like wildfire. Suddenly, passengers weren't just flying. They were bearing witness. And Zuri wasn't done. She unveiled the Elevate Fund, a scholarship for children who had never believed airplanes were for them. Not the wealthy, not the privileged, the overlooked, the silenced. One letter arrived, scrawled in pencil by a girl in Detroit. "If the sky belongs to everyone, let me learn how to touch it." Zuri boarded a flight in secret, dressed as no one special, sliding into a middle seat. Next to her sat a small girl gripping a sketchbook filled with airplanes. Halfway through the flight, the child whispered like she was afraid the sky might overhear. "This is my first time flying. It feels like it actually wants me here." Zuri's throat tightened. She turned to the window, the lights of cities scattered below like constellations. She remembered the torn boarding pass in her mother's hand. The humiliation burned into her childhood. And in that moment, she knew the story had been rewritten, not for her, for all of them. The Great Hall of the United Nations had witnessed decades of voices, some sharp with authority, others dulled by the weight of politics. Yet when Zuri Carter walked to the podium, the air itself seemed to lift. She carried no notes, no shield of polished rhetoric, only her memory, her truth, and the countless stories stitched into her heart. Her voice began quietly, almost fragile, yet every syllable echoed as if the walls had been waiting for it. When I was 12, a boarding pass was torn in half before my eyes. To some, it was just paper. To me, it was a verdict. You do not belong up here. The chamber hushed. Delegates leaned forward, their pens forgotten. She paused, allowing the silence to throb with the weight of that wound. Then, with a breath, her tone rose, not in anger, but in a force that soared. Today I return not as the child denied her sky, but as the woman entrusted with wings. And I tell you this, we have not only rewritten policy, we have rewritten the meaning of flight. Every journey now carries the voices of those who were unseen, the mechanic whose hands shine with oil, the cook whose quiet labor fed 1,000 journeys, the elder who once feared age, meant erasure. Their stories rise with every takeoff. Their dignity lands with every arrival. Images filled the vast screens behind her, faces radiant, voices unshaken. Every seat has a story. Every story matters. Something shifted in the chamber. It was no longer an airline executive addressing a council. It was humanity calling itself higher. Zuri's final words unfurled like wings stretching across the sky. At 30,000 feet, there are no walls, no borders, no ranks. The sky makes us equal. And if the heavens can hold us all, then so can we. For a heartbeat, silence. So pure, so absolute, that it felt the world itself was listening. Then the room erupted, not applause, but a rising storm of sound, fierce and uncontainable. Some wept openly, others stood without realizing, swept into a tide larger than themselves. And on the balcony, a young girl clutched her notebook of airplanes. Her eyes glistened, her breath caught. She did not whisper a dream. She felt it. The sky had opened, and it wanted her there. When Zuri left the podium of the United Nations, she thought the applause would fade into routine headlines. Instead, the words ignited like dry grass in a summer wind. By nightfall, her speech was playing on every screen from Nairobi to New Orleans. By dawn, it was graffiti on bridges, chants at protests, and whispers in factory break rooms. The sky makes us equal. But the fire that spread hope also lit fear. Within days, executives from rival airlines met in private, their smiles tight, their voices sharp. "She's turning an industry into a pulpit," one hissed. "If people believe her, they'll start questioning us all." A senator, once her ally, called her privately. "Zuri, the world isn't ready for this. Tone it down, or you'll bring the storm on yourself." Storms came anyway. In Los Angeles, airport workers staged a midnight march, holding paper airplanes lit with candles. In Atlanta, thousands filled the streets, chanting her words until police sirens drowned them out. One wrong push, and the crowd boiled into chaos. Across the ocean in Paris, protesters draped banners from terminal rooftops. "If the heavens can hold us all, why can't we?" Zuri watched the broadcasts in silence, a weight pressing against her ribs. This had gone beyond airlines, beyond her control. A board member warned, They're calling you a revolutionary, not a CEO. That's dangerous. Another sneered. Your company isn't an airline anymore. It's an uprising with wings. She didn't answer. But that night, when she tried to walk into her own headquarters, she found the entrance swarmed by both supporters chanting her name and opponents waving signs that painted her as a traitor. Police stood between them, shields up, batons ready. Inside, her office phone rang again and again, world leaders asking her to speak, to lead, to choose. Outside, the chants grew louder, the tension near breaking. Zuri looked at the torn boarding pass framed on her wall, its edges fragile but unyielding. For years, it had been her reminder of injustice. Now, it felt like a prophecy. She was no longer deciding the future of an airline. She was standing at the fault line of a movement the world had not prepared for. And everyone, friend and enemy alike, was waiting for her next step. The world cracked open in a way no one foresaw. In New York, thousands of passengers refused to leave the terminal, their chants drowning out boarding calls until security shut down entire concourses. In Sao Paulo, ground crew abandoned their posts, forming a human barricade across the runway. In Paris, police helicopters circled low as banners stretched between rooftops. The sky is ours. At first, governments tried to contain it. They called it a labor dispute, a PR flare-up. But then it spread to places no one expected. Teachers marching with cardboard wings, dock workers halting ships, nurses wearing flight pins on their uniforms. What began in airports had bled into the arteries of society. Inside Co-Air headquarters, the air was suffocating. Shareholders pounded the table. "You've lost control!" one shouted, his voice breaking. "This isn't a company anymore. It's an uprising, and you've lit the fuse." Zuri sat motionless, her hands folded, but her mind was a storm. Every screen around her showed another country in flames, another crowd invoking her words. Some held her face on banners like a saint. Others painted it on effigies and set them alight. She was savior and villain, prophet and threat, all at once. And then came the night when the storm broke at her very doorstep. The plaza outside headquarters seethed with bodies, one side roaring her name, the other cursing it. The air shimmered with tension so sharp it could snap at any second. Police in riot gear stood between the factions, shields gleaming under floodlights, batons twitching in nervous hands. A bottle smashed. A scream cut through the night. The first line of officers shoved forward. From the upper floor, Zuri watched as chaos churned below, her reflection trembling in the glass. She turned toward her desk, where the torn boarding pass lay framed, its jagged edges a wound that had never healed. For years, it had reminded her of what was stolen. Now, it pulsed like a command. Do not turn away. She walked toward the doors. Her advisors grabbed her arm. "You can't go out there, it's a war zone." But she shook them off. The roar of the crowd grew louder with each step. The glass doors hissed open. A wall of sound slammed into her, raw and deafening. Supporters screamed her name. Opponents hurled curses. Police tensed, knuckles white on their weapons. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Every eye locked on her silhouette framed in the doorway. And then, silence, sudden and absolute, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Zuri stood between the two sides, the sky dark above her, the air alive with danger. In that frozen instant, she knew. Whatever words left her lips next would not just decide her future. They would decide whether the night ended in blood or in flight. The plaza quivered on the edge of violence. Chants collided like waves smashing against rock. Police lines buckled under the pressure of two crowds locked in hatred, supporters screaming Zuri's name, opponents spitting her down. And then, without a word, she crossed the barricade. The officers hesitated, shields twitching, as she walked into the narrow strip of concrete no one dared to claim. The noise fractured, half cheers, half fury, until it was only raw sound, jagged and unbearable. She raised her hand, not to calm them, not to command them, but to show what she held. A piece of paper, yellowed with years, its edges jagged. The torn boarding pass. The crowd stuttered. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Zuri's voice, quiet but sharp, sliced through the air. They told me this pass was worthless, that I was worthless. But this scrap of paper has carried me further than their rules ever could. It carried me here. She swept her gaze across the chaos, her eyes burning. And it has carried all of you with me. A bottle shattered against a police shield. The crowd lurched. For an instant, it seemed her words had failed. But Zuri didn't stop. Her voice rose, fierce now. Look at this paper. Weak, torn, broken. Yet still it survived. And so will we, if we choose not to tear each other apart. The words hit like thunder. Some screamed in triumph. Others shouted back in rage. The plaza shook with 1,000 conflicting currents. No single chant strong enough to drown the others. Then, from deep in the throng, a child's voice rang out, high and piercing. The sky makes us equal! The sound rippled outward, hesitant at first, then swelling. Yet just as the chant began to take hold, a flare arced across the night sky, landing with a hiss at the police line. Smoke erupted. Shouts turned to coughs. Panic surged. Zuri froze, her boarding pass trembling in her hand. The crowd split, some pressing forward in fury, others stumbling back in fear. Police advanced, batons raised. In that split second, no one could tell what would happen next. Would the night collapse into bloodshed, or transform into something greater than any one of them could imagine? The plaza held its breath, every fate balanced on a knife's edge. The plaza detonated. The flare exploded against the pavement, white smoke rolling like a tidal wave. Police shields slammed forward. Batons cracked skulls. Protesters surged back with bottles, bricks, fists. The night split into fire and screams. A man went down under a boot, his cry cut short. Blood spread dark on the concrete. Zuri stumbled into the chaos, the torn boarding pass clutched in her hand like a relic. "Stop!" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of rage. She saw a woman trampled, her arms clawing at the air. She saw a young officer, no older than her interns, trembling as he swung blindly at anyone near. This wasn't a protest anymore. It was war. And then it happened, out of nowhere, sharp as lightning. A child's voice pierced the carnage. The sky makes us equal! High, cracked, desperate. It cut through batons, through screams, through the madness. Heads turned, arms faltered mid-strike. For a heartbeat, the violence stuttered. The voice came again, stronger. The sky makes us equal! Others took it up, ragged at first, then swelling, until the chant thundered across the plaza. The sky makes us equal! The sky makes us equal! Zuri raised the torn boarding pass above her head. Her voice was raw, trembling, but it carried. They tried to tear this apart. Look at it. Broken, scarred, but still here. Just like us. Something cracked. Not a baton this time, but the spell of hatred. Protesters who seconds earlier had hurled stones now lifted the fallen from the ground. An officer ripped off his helmet, tossed aside his shield, and knelt to help a bleeding man. The chant grew louder, drowning the chaos. Tears streaked through soot and blood. Some still fought, fists unwilling to unclench, but the tide had turned. Violence gave way to something more primal, more unstoppable. A unity born in the very heart of carnage. Zuri stood shaking, the boarding pass trembling in her fist, her eyes burning with smoke and fury. For years, it had been her reminder of shame. Tonight, it had become a flag. The cameras caught it all, the blood, the fear, the chant that rose from it like a storm. And as the world watched, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer an airline story. It was the beginning of a revolution. By sunrise, the world no longer belonged to yesterday. Every screen flickered with the same images. A plaza drowning in smoke and screams, a woman standing alone with a torn boarding pass raised like a relic, a child's voice slicing through chaos with a single line. The sky makes us equal. It didn't play like news. It played like destiny. In New York, anchors sat stunned in silence before whispering, "We are watching history unfold." In Tokyo, commuters stopped in stations to stare at giant screens replaying her silhouette against firelight. In Lagos, street vendors tuned battered radios to catch fragments of her words, murmuring them like scripture. By mid-morning, murals of Zuri's face were already rising on walls from Rio to Johannesburg, painted overnight by hands that worked in secret. Governments convulsed. In Washington, senators nearly came to blows, half calling for her arrest, half demanding she be honored in Congress. In Paris, riot police stood idle as protesters draped banners from bridges. "If the heavens can hold us, so can we." In Nairobi, children painted paper wings, shouting her chant into the wind until their throats were hoarse. Corporations scrambled, rivals denounced her as a demagogue, her own board threatened removal. Yet within hours their employees staged walkouts, chanting her name in defiance. A billionaire sneered on live TV, "She's not a CEO, she's a cult." But by nightfall, his own workers had painted her words on the gates of his factory. And Zuri? She sat in her darkened office, blinds drawn, the city vibrating outside like a living drum. Calls poured in from presidents, journalists, and activists. Some begged her to calm the fire. Others demanded she claim it. All eyes, all voices, all hope funneled to her alone. On her desk lay the torn boarding pass, once trash, now an artifact. Its jagged edges glowed in the lamplight like the crown of a reluctant queen. For years, it had been her wound. Tonight, it was the world's banner. Zuri pressed it to her chest, the chant outside echoing into her bones. "The sky makes us equal." And in that moment, she understood with terrifying clarity, she could never again be just a CEO. History had cracked open and chosen her to walk through. The chamber of the United Nations had never been so still, hundreds of eyes fixed on the lone figure at the podium. Zuri Carter did not stand like a CEO delivering a speech. She stood like a survivor carrying the weight of generations. In her hands was no report, no polished script, only a framed fragment of paper, yellowed and torn down the middle. She held it up. The torn ticket caught the light. "This," she said, her voice ringing with fire, "was once used to tell me I did not belong. It was torn from my hands when I was 12 years old, before I had the chance to board the sky I had dreamed of since I could walk. A stranger told me without words that I was invisible, that my dreams were disposable." The hall shifted. Delegates leaned in. Some swallowed hard. "But today," she continued, her voice climbing, "I return this ticket to the world not as a wound, but as a weapon. Because what they tore was not just paper. It was the illusion that power could silence us. They tried to clip our wings, and here we are, still flying." Gasps rippled, followed by a silence so taut it felt like the air before a storm. Zuri's next words cut through it like lightning. "The sky belongs to all of us, or it belongs to none." The chamber erupted. Delegates shot to their feet, pounding the tables, the applause swelling into something more like thunder. Outside, crowds watching on giant screens roared, tears streaming down their faces, fists raised high. In living rooms across America, families held one another and wept, because this wasn't just Zuri's victory, it was theirs. Every insult swallowed, every opportunity denied, every time they had been told to wait their turn. This moment repaid it all. Zuri did not smile in triumph. She pressed the glass frame against the podium as if laying it to rest. "Never again," she said, softer now, but carried by the roar of voices outside. "Never again will a child be told they don't belong in the sky." When she stepped back, the ovation followed her like a wave crashing over the chamber. She turned to the window, to the night sky split by the white trail of a jet, and for the first time since she was 12, she felt not broken, not burdened, but free. The torn ticket had come full circle. What was once humiliation had become history. And every person watching knew, deep in their bones, that the sky had finally opened. For everyone. At the very gate where her childhood dreams were once torn apart, a new scene unfolded. Families bustled, announcements echoed, but in the center, a small ceremony was taking place. The airline had dedicated Gate 12 to her story. A bronze plaque was unveiled, its words blazing like truth carved into stone. "The sky belongs to everyone. May no ticket ever be torn in silence again." The crowd broke into applause. Children of every color pressed forward, holding their boarding passes high, as if lifting them toward the heavens. Zuri stood quietly at the back. No spotlight, no stage. A little boy tugged at her sleeve, his voice small but certain. "Miss, do you think I can be a pilot someday?" Her throat tightened. She knelt, eyes shining. "Not someday," she whispered. "Today, the sky's already waiting for you." And as the roar of a departing jet thundered overhead, every heart there believed it. And so, Zuri's journey leaves us with more than a story. It leaves us with a responsibility. A torn ticket once meant silence and shame, but today it has become a symbol of justice, courage, and change. It reminds us that even the smallest act of cruelty can ripple through lives, and yet so can the smallest act of resistance. This is not just her story. It belongs to all of us. It is a mirror asking, will we stand by when someone is denied their place? Or will we speak until the sky is truly open to everyone? If this story moved you, if it sparked anger, hope, or courage, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that confront injustice and celebrate resilience. Because every time you amplify a voice like Zuri's, you help create a world where no child's dream is torn in half. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching, for listening, for carrying this story forward. May you walk away not only inspired, but ready to act. And until we meet again, stay awake, stay kind, and may the skies of your own journey always remain open, limitless, and bright.